It all started when 50,000 volts surged through someone's body and made a sound you never forget. It was around 2 a.m., and the HOA patrol had climbed our fence again, convinced that something as harmless as my home internet setup posed a serious threat to the entire neighborhood. I never imagined my Wi-Fi router could turn my 73-year-old grandfather into an electrical genius or make the HOA patrol call an ambulance twice. But some people just won't leave you alone, no matter how reasonable you try to be. This story began after I moved back into my childhood home in Pinewood Estates following the collapse of my AI startup. It was supposed to be a temporary reset, not a full-on war with a conspiracy theorist neighbor. Standing in my old bedroom, now a makeshift office filled with dusty memories, I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. From being a CEO to helping Grandpa fix cables, life really flips fast. The same room where I used to dream about changing the world was now where I struggled to land freelance web development gigs, just to keep the lights on. To work from home effectively, I needed solid internet speed. So I upgraded to a high-powered Wi-Fi router and installed a mesh network system that covered the whole house. What I didn't expect was that this simple tech upgrade would trigger weeks of harassment from Rick Maddox, a middle-aged man with way too much time on his hands and a head full of conspiracy theories. Rick wasn't just some random weirdo. He used to be an electrical technician for the city until he got fired after what his boss politely called electromagnetic radiation paranoia following an incident near a radio tower. Since losing his job over a year ago, Rick had fallen deep into the rabbit hole of 5G conspiracies. He even started a website called EMF Fighters with exactly 127 subscribers and appointed himself the unofficial electromagnetic safety officer of our quiet suburban neighborhood. He spent hours watching conspiracy videos, bought professional-grade EMF detectors online, and genuinely believed he was protecting families from invisible radiation poisoning. What made Rick especially dangerous wasn't just his delusions, it was his technical background. He knew just enough to sound convincing to people who didn't know better. It was 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning when Rick first showed up at my door wearing what looked like a homemade radiation-proof vest and waving an EMF detector that beeped like a smoke alarm. He was having what can only be described as a full-blown meltdown. "Tyler Brooks," he announced like he was delivering a verdict, "your Wi-Fi signal is exceeding safe residential levels by 340%. I blinked at him, coffee mug in hand, trying to process why my neighbor looked like a discount Ghostbuster and treated my router like it was Chernobyl. "Rick, right? It's just a regular Wi-Fi router, man. Same kind everyone has." But Rick waved his device at me like he was casting a spell and said, "This machine doesn't lie, Brooks. You're broadcasting toxic levels of electromagnetic radiation into our community." The way he said broadcasting made it sound like I was running a pirate radio station instead of just trying to stream Netflix without buffering. What made Rick's harassment so frustrating was how he mixed real technical terms with total nonsense. He quoted studies from websites like 5G Truth Warriors and Electromagnetic Freedom Fighters, claiming powerful Wi-Fi signals were killing bees, confusing birds, and slowing children's brain development. "They want to control our minds through 5G wavelengths, bro," he'd say with the conviction of someone who thought he'd uncovered the secret truth everyone else missed. The electromagnetic radiation is literally cooking our DNA from the inside out. I tried explaining that Wi-Fi routers operate at 1 watt of power, less than 1,000th of what a microwave oven uses, but Rick just shook his head and muttered about big tech brainwashing and sheeple who can't see the truth. From the kitchen, I could hear my grandpa, Henry, chuckling under his breath. 40 years I designed radar systems for the Air Force, he muttered. And now some guy off the street wants to teach me about electromagnetic waves? Grandpa Henry had worked with military radar installations that operated at power levels 50,000 times stronger than my home setup. When he heard Rick's claims about dangerous radiation, it was like listening to someone argue that birthday candles are more dangerous than blowtorches. But Rick didn't care about actual expertise. He cared about being right, being important, and having someone to blame for the mess his life had become. The confrontation ended with Rick handing me a handwritten notice demanding I reduce my router's power output to safe community levels within 48 hours or face protective intervention by concerned citizens. As he walked away, still waving his EMF detector like a divining rod, he called over his shoulder, "Tyler Brooks, you have 2 days to do the right thing. After that, I'll have to protect this community by any means necessary." I watched him march down the street, stopping at every house with visible Wi-Fi equipment, taking readings like some kind of paranoid inspector general. That's when I realized this wasn't just going to be a silly neighbor dispute. Rick had the obsessive focus of someone who found his life's mission, the vocabulary to sound authoritative to the uninformed, and apparently all the free time in the world to make my life miserable. What I didn't know yet was that Rick had already mapped every Wi-Fi network in the neighborhood, documented our daily schedules with military precision, and recruited 2 neighbors who actually believed my router was slowly killing their kids. The war for Pinewood Estates was about to begin, and I had no idea what Rick had planned for tomorrow night. Within a week of our first encounter, Rick transformed from a lone conspiracy theorist into the leader of what he proudly called the Electromagnetic Safety Unit. Watching him recruit followers was like witnessing a masterclass in how fear spreads faster than facts. His first convert was Tommy Watson, a 38-year-old who'd been unemployed since the pandemic and had way too much time online. Absorbing whatever content confirmed his growing belief that the world was falling apart around him. Rick approached Tommy with friendship, purpose, and free equipment, lending him a $50 EMF detector and telling him he could be part of something bigger. "Tommy, you've got kids, right?" Rick said. "Don't you want to protect them from invisible dangers the government won't tell you about?" Within 48 hours, Tommy was a true believer, posting on local message boards about electromagnetic contamination and volunteering to help Rick with his investigation. Steve Collins was an easier mark, an early retiree in his mid-50s who was bored, lonely, and missing the sense of importance he once felt during his career in middle management. Rick didn't even need to convince Steve that Wi-Fi was dangerous. He just needed to convince him that he was smart enough to understand the real science everyone else was ignoring. "Steve, you've got an engineering background, right?" Rick said. "You can see what these EMF readings mean. Most people can't interpret this data, but someone with your technical knowledge." Together, they formed a group chat called EMF Warriors, where Rick shared links to conspiracy websites, posted photos of EMF meter readings, and made his recruits feel like elite defenders of the neighborhood against corporate greed and government cover-ups. What made Rick's strategy so effective was how he mixed legitimate concerns with paranoid fantasies. He'd start conversations by asking about headaches, sleep issues, or anxiety, universal experiences anyone could relate to, and then suggest those symptoms might be linked to EMF exposure. "Have you noticed more headaches since all these new Wi-Fi networks went up?" he'd ask. "Have your kids seemed more irritable lately?" These aren't coincidences, my friend. The human body isn't designed to handle this level of electromagnetic bombardment. Rick had studied the language of environmental health advocates and medical conspiracy theorists, learning how to sound concerned instead of crazy, protective instead of paranoid. He presented himself as a reluctant truth-teller who discovered something terrible and felt morally obligated to warn his neighbors, even if it cost him personally. Meanwhile, Barbara Campbell, the HOA president, quietly encouraged Rick's activities through carefully worded emails that gave her plausible deniability. "Several residents have expressed concerns about potential health impacts from increased electronic device usage in the neighborhood," she wrote. "Perhaps some investigation would be appropriate to address community safety questions." Barbara never directly told Rick to harass me or violate property rights, but she created an environment where he felt supported, sanctioned, and important. She'd mention his valuable community service at HOA meetings, thank him for his diligent neighborhood monitoring, and make vague references to taking action if certain residents didn't address legitimate safety concerns raised by their neighbors. The escalation followed a familiar pattern anyone who's dealt with obsessive personalities would recognize. Week 1 was surveillance and documentation. Rick and his team measuring radiation levels from the sidewalk, snapping photos of Wi-Fi equipment through windows, and creating spreadsheets tracking internet usage patterns across different houses. Week 2 brought the educational campaign. Rick went door to door with printed articles about EMF dangers, showing neighbors his detector readings and explaining how they could protect their families by adjusting their internet habits. By week 3, Rick was confronting me almost every other day, demanding I install radiation shields on my router, limit Wi-Fi use to essential hours only, and pay for an electromagnetic assessment conducted by his cousin, who suddenly became a certified expert after taking an online course. What frustrated me most wasn't Rick's scientific ignorance. Plenty of people believe dumb things without turning into neighborhood tyrants. What really got under my skin was how his harassment affected my ability to work and earn a living. I started avoiding looking out the windows because I knew Rick was probably out there with his detector, documenting my radiation emissions like some kind of rogue environmental watchdog. I started avoiding looking out the windows because I knew Rick was probably out there with his EMF detector, documenting my radiation emissions like some kind of electromagnetic private investigator. I'd catch myself shutting down my computer earlier than necessary, worried that he was noting when my Wi-Fi traffic was at its peak. The constant low-level anxiety of being watched and judged for completely normal activities was exhausting in a way I couldn't easily explain to friends who didn't live in my neighborhood. When I lost a major client contract because my internet kept mysteriously dropping during video calls, I started to suspect Rick's monitoring might involve more direct interference than I had initially realized. From the kitchen, I could hear Grandpa Henry getting increasingly irritated as he listened to me deal with Rick's daily confrontations. "That man isn't just ignorant, Tyler," he muttered one afternoon. "He's actively destroying your livelihood because he thinks he's smarter than 40 years of communications engineering research." Henry had started paying attention to Rick's activities with the focused interest of someone who'd spent decades troubleshooting complex technical problems and wasn't about to let some delusional amateur make his grandson's life miserable. I didn't know it yet, but Henry was already researching property protection laws, ordering specialized equipment online, and planning a response that would teach Rick the difference between theoretical electromagnetic radiation and practical electrical engineering. That night, Rick posted a live stream to his EMF Fighters channel with 347 viewers watching him hold up wire cutters and a detailed floor plan of our house. Phase 2 begins at midnight, he announced with the calm confidence of someone who'd crossed the line from concerned citizen to dangerous obsessive. Sometimes protecting innocent families requires direct intervention. Rick's transformation from passive surveillance to active sabotage happened gradually, then all at once, like watching someone's grip on reality slip one finger at a time until they're hanging by their fingernails over a cliff of their own making. He convinced Tommy and Steve that I was some kind of electromagnetic terrorist who selfishly refused to cooperate with reasonable community safety measures, painting me as a dangerous individual who cared more about internet speed than children's health. "Brooks won't listen to reason, gentlemen," Rick told them. "Sometimes good people have to take difficult action to protect innocent families from selfish individuals who put profits over public safety." Rick had spent weeks building up to this moment, gradually escalating his rhetoric until direct intervention seemed not only justified, but morally necessary to protect the neighborhood from my supposedly toxic Wi-Fi signals. The plan, as Rick explained it to his followers, was simple: enter my property while I was away to document dangerous equipment and temporarily disable radiation sources until proper authorities could address the electromagnetic contamination. Rick had researched my schedule with disturbing thoroughness. He knew I usually left for client meetings around 11 a.m. on Tuesdays, that Grandpa Henry took his daily walk to the coffee shop at 10:30, and that we'd both be away from the house for at least 2 hours. What Rick didn't count on was that I'd installed security cameras the previous week after noticing footprints in my flower beds and suspicious activity around my outdoor electrical meter. He also didn't know that Grandpa Henry had been making his own preparations, quietly upgrading our home security in ways that weren't immediately visible to amateur surveillance. At exactly 11:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, Rick boosted Tommy over our back fence to scout the electromagnetic source location, while Steve stood guard with an EMF detector that was beeping frantically near our electrical panel, which should have been their first clue that maybe they didn't understand how these devices actually worked. Tommy was supposed to locate and photograph the Wi-Fi router, document any unsafe installation practices, and determine whether temporary disconnection was feasible without causing property damage. But when Tommy grabbed the metal gate latch to steady himself while climbing down from the fence, he got a small static shock that made him jump and yelp in surprise. "Rick, there's electricity in the gate," he whispered urgently into his walkie-talkie, clearly spooked by the unexpected sensation. Rick, monitoring from the street with binoculars like some kind of suburban spy, immediately jumped to the wrong conclusion. That's electromagnetic discharge from the router. It proves how dangerous this setup really is. What followed was a comedy of errors that would have been hilarious if it weren't happening on my property without my permission. Tommy, now convinced he was dealing with some kind of high-tech radiation weapon, nervously approached the house while Steve's EMF detector went crazy near every piece of electrical equipment: the air conditioning unit, the outdoor outlets, the cable TV connection box. Rick provided running commentary through their walkie-talkies, treating normal electromagnetic signatures like evidence of criminal activity. "Bravo team, radiation levels are spiking near the south wall. Proceed with extreme caution." Tommy managed to unplug my Wi-Fi router and several Ethernet cables, apparently believing this would neutralize the electromagnetic threat. But in his nervousness, he also kicked over some landscaping stones and accidentally damaged a basement window screen. I returned home early that day because my client had canceled our meeting and immediately noticed that my internet was completely down, not just slow, but entirely non-functional in a way that suggested physical disconnection rather than service problems. Walking around the house, I found obvious footprints in the muddy flower beds, damaged window screening, and clear evidence that someone had been tampering with my electronics. The security cameras that Grandpa Henry had installed captured everything: Rick directing the operation from the street, Tommy struggling with networking equipment he clearly didn't understand, and Steve waving his EMF detector around like he was looking for buried treasure instead of measuring electromagnetic radiation. When I called the non-emergency police line to report the trespassing and property damage, Officer Daniel Ross arrived within 20 minutes and reviewed the security footage with professional interest. When Officer Ross went to Rick's house to discuss the incident, Rick launched into a passionate defense. "Officer, we were conducting an emergency intervention. The electromagnetic radiation levels from Brooks' equipment had reached critical thresholds." Officer Ross later explained that his supervisor had instructed him to handle things diplomatically because Rick was a former city employee with HOA connections. "I've written up a report, but unless he escalates to more serious damage, my hands are tied." This was exactly the wrong message to send to someone like Rick, who interpreted official restraint as validation. The incident split our small neighborhood into factions. Some people thought Rick was obviously unhinged, but others started wondering whether there might be something to his electromagnetic concerns. After all, why would he risk legal trouble unless he discovered something genuinely dangerous? Rick skillfully exploited this uncertainty by sharing his evidence with anyone who'd listen: photos of EMF readings, printouts of cherry-pick studies, and testimonials from his growing network of online conspiracy theorists. What I didn't realize until later was that Rick had planted evidence during his trespassing. An old cell phone battery buried in my garden that he could later discover and present as proof that I was improperly disposing of electronic waste in violation of environmental safety regulations. But Rick's trespassing adventure had given him something more dangerous than fake evidence. It had given him confidence. That evening, I found a handwritten note taped to our front door. Brooks, you have 48 hours to remove all electromagnetic weapons or face citizen intervention. The children of this neighborhood will be protected." Rick wasn't backing down, he was doubling down. The night I lost my second major client contract because Rick had somehow convinced my internet service provider to reduce my connection speed for community safety reasons, I found Grandpa Henry sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., staring at a photograph of my late grandmother and muttering under his breath, "If Martha were still alive, she'd tell me to wire that fence and teach that lunatic the difference between Wi-Fi signals and real electricity." Henry had been watching Rick's escalating harassment with the growing anger of someone who'd spent 4 decades solving complex technical problems and wasn't about to let some delusional amateur destroy his grandson's livelihood based on scientific illiteracy and paranoid fantasy. What I didn't know was that Henry had already started researching Texas property protection laws, ordering specialized electrical equipment online, and developing a comprehensive plan to end Rick's harassment in a way that would be both legally defensible and educationally memorable. Henry had spent 40 years designing military radar systems that operated at power levels thousands of times stronger than residential Wi-Fi routers. He'd literally written technical manuals about electromagnetic compatibility and radio frequency interference. When Rick talked about dangerous radiation levels from my 1-watt Wi-Fi router, Henry heard the same kind of ignorant fear-mongering he used to encounter from civilians who didn't understand the difference between ionizing radiation, which can cause cancer, and non-ionizing radio waves, which are as harmless as visible light. But what really pushed Henry from irritation to action was discovering the extent of Rick's neighborhood harassment campaign through his own door-to-door investigation. What he found revealed a pattern of systematic intimidation affecting 8 different families. Mrs. Gloria Henderson, a 67-year-old widow who lived alone, had been pressured into disconnecting her smart TV and medical alert system because Rick convinced her that electromagnetic radiation was causing her insomnia and joint pain. The Johnson family had been so frightened by Rick's warnings about Wi-Fi dangers to developing brains that they started turning off their internet router every night, making it impossible for their teenage daughter to complete online homework assignments. Even the Rodriguez household, where the father worked as an electrician and should have known better, had been intimidated into relocating their wireless router from the centrally located living room to a back bedroom, significantly reducing their internet coverage throughout the house. What made Rick's harassment campaign particularly insidious was how he learned to exploit people's natural concern for their family's health and safety, presenting himself as a reluctant truth-teller who'd discovered dangerous information that the government and telecommunications companies didn't want people to know. Rick had created a website called EMF Fighters with over 1,000 subscribers, where he posted daily updates about electromagnetic contamination in our neighborhood, detailed maps showing radiation danger zones around different houses, and instructions for citizen EMF enforcement that bordered on vigilante tactics. He developed a sophisticated propaganda operation that mixed legitimate-sounding scientific terminology with paranoid misinformation, convincing enough people to doubt reality and question basic physics. And all of this, every post, every accusation, every scare tactic, traced back to a single man with too much time, too many conspiracy theories, and a deep need to feel important. What none of them knew yet was that Grandpa Henry had decided enough was enough, and he was about to show Rick the difference between talking about electricity and actually touching a live wire. Rick's harassment didn't just affect me. It created a ripple effect through the entire neighborhood. Families who had never questioned their own home electronics suddenly found themselves second-guessing everything from Wi-Fi routers to smart speakers. He was especially effective at exploiting universal concerns like headaches, insomnia, or anxiety, things nearly everyone experiences at some point, and tying them to his favorite villain, electromagnetic radiation. He'd say things like, "Have you noticed more migraines since all these new networks went up?" Or, "Your daughter's been more irritable lately. Haven't you noticed that too?" It sounded like concern, but it wasn't. It was manipulation wrapped in pseudoscience. And people listened not because Rick had any real expertise, but because he sounded confident, used technical-sounding language, and came across as someone doing what he thought was right. That made him dangerous. What really pushed my grandfather over the edge wasn't just Rick's obsession with me, it was when Henry discovered how many families had been affected. Through his own quiet investigations, knocking on doors, asking questions, listening, he uncovered a pattern of fear-mongering and intimidation that had touched 8 different households. There was Mrs. Gloria Henderson, a 67-year-old widow who lived alone. Rick had convinced her that electromagnetic radiation was causing her sleeplessness and joint pain so thoroughly that she disconnected both her smart TV and her medical alert system. For an elderly woman living alone, that decision could have been life-threatening. The Johnson family was so scared by Rick's warnings about Wi-Fi dangers affecting brain development that they started turning off their router every night. Their teenage daughter couldn't finish homework online, all because of a baseless theory spread by someone who got his science from conspiracy websites. Even the Rodriguez household, where the father worked as an actual electrician, had fallen victim to Rick's pressure. They moved their wireless router from the central living room to a back bedroom just to avoid being harassed again, despite knowing full well that the change significantly weakened their internet signal throughout the house. Rick's campaign wasn't just about spreading fear, it was about control. He presented himself as a reluctant truth-teller who had stumbled upon information too dangerous to ignore, making people feel like they were part of something bigger, something noble. But beneath the surface, it was clear he was using those fears to build his own sense of importance. He even built a website called EMF Fighters, which grew to over 1,000 subscribers, where he posted daily updates about supposed electromagnetic contamination in our neighborhood, detailed maps showing radiation danger zones, and instructions for what he called citizen EMF enforcement. The line between community concern and vigilante behavior blurred more and more with each post. It was a sophisticated propaganda machine, mixing just enough legitimate terminology with paranoid nonsense to sound convincing to people who didn't know better. Meanwhile, Barbara Campbell, the HOA president, quietly supported Rick's activities through carefully worded emails that gave her plausible deniability. She never directly encouraged trespassing or sabotage, but she created an environment where Rick felt validated and empowered. At HOA meetings, she praised his community service and made vague references to taking action if residents didn't address legitimate safety concerns. That kind of passive encouragement was exactly what Rick needed. It turned him from a solo conspiracy theorist into the self-appointed leader of what he called the Electromagnetic Safety Unit, a group of 3 guys waving EMF detectors around like they were on a ghost hunt. But the breaking point came when Rick escalated beyond surveillance and started planting fake evidence. During one of his trespassing attempts, he buried an old cell phone battery in my garden, planning to later discover it and claim I was illegally disposing of electronic waste, another attempt to paint me as a threat to the neighborhood. This was no longer just harassment. It was a full-on crusade based on paranoia and delusion. Then came the handwritten note on our front door. Rick wasn't backing down, he was doubling down. When I lost yet another major client contract because Rick had somehow convinced my ISP to throttle my connection speed under the guise of community safety, I found Grandpa Henry sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., staring at a photo of my late grandmother and muttering under his breath, "If Martha were still alive, she'd tell me to wire that fence and teach that lunatic the difference between Wi-Fi signals and real electricity." Henry had spent 40 years designing military radar systems, technology that operated at power levels thousands of times stronger than a residential Wi-Fi router. He'd written technical manuals on electromagnetic compatibility and radio frequency interference. When Rick talked about dangerous radiation from a 1-watt device, Henry heard the same kind of ignorant fear-mongering he used to encounter from civilians who didn't understand the difference between ionizing radiation and non-ionizing radio waves. But what really lit the fuse for Grandpa wasn't just Rick's scientific illiteracy, it was seeing how much damage Rick had done to innocent families. That's when Henry decided enough was enough. He began researching Texas property protection laws, ordering specialized electrical equipment online, and developing a comprehensive plan, not just to stop Rick, but to teach him a lesson he wouldn't forget. While Rick was busy building his paranoid empire, Grandpa Henry was quietly preparing a response that would combine decades of engineering knowledge with a little bit of frontier justice. And when Rick finally made his boldest move yet, attempting to break into our house in the dead of night to plant fake evidence, he was about to learn the hard way just how outmatched he was.